Welcome to Standing to Ground. In this video, we will look at the standing position in no-gi Jiu-Jitsu. The content of this first video is centered around the skills required in neutral position as two athletes stand in front of each other. The emphasis will be on takedowns from neutral and the auxiliary skills required to make these skills work against knowledgeable resistance. Even seemingly small elements, such as the fact that Jiu-Jitsu is practiced barefoot as opposed to wrestling being practiced in shoes, makes a significant difference. Shoes create much stronger drive from the floor when finishing driving leg tackles. Working out barefoot makes for much easier foot sweeps, and certain kinds of takedown defenses featuring slipping your feet and legs away from an opponent's grasp become much easier in Jiu-Jitsu. Of course, the presence of submission greatly changes the standing game in Jiu-Jitsu. Submission is valued above everything else in Jiu-Jitsu. Many forms of takedown can be very strongly countered by submission holds, which often makes the athletes very cautious in how they attempt to take each other down in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Many of the moves of wrestling and Judo become inappropriate in situations where flying arm bars, flying triangles, and flying leg locks can easily be employed. Perhaps the single biggest conceptual difference between Jiu-Jitsu and other grappling arts in the standing game is that risk is punished in Jiu-Jitsu, whereas risk is generally rewarded in Judo and wrestling. In both wrestling and Judo, if a takedown fails, you can simply hold on to the leg and stalemate in the case of wrestling, or recover to turtle position in the case of Judo, and the referee will eventually intervene to protect you. In Jiu-Jitsu, there is no referee intervention to help you. If your takedown fails and you are caught in compromised position, you have to dig yourself out of the hole you've created with no help from the referee. This has the immediate effect that people are much more reticent to enter into takedowns in Jiu-Jitsu than they are in Judo and in wrestling. These considerations mean that the standing game in Jiu-Jitsu is radically different from other grappling arts. Jiu-Jitsu needs to borrow liberally from Judo and wrestling for technique, but it needs to balance this with a well-thought-out program of modification and adaptation to embed these techniques effectively into the Jiu-Jitsu rule set. I believe this will be one of the great projects in Jiu-Jitsu over the next decade, and one which will take our sport closer to its eventual perfection. When I first began teaching Jiu-Jitsu many years ago, one of the first actions I took was to make a list of the weaknesses of Jiu-Jitsu as I saw them. There were quite a few areas on that list, but the two at the top were leg locks and standing grappling/takedowns. Jiu-Jitsu is mostly practiced on the ground, and the most desirable outcomes, submission holds and the various mounted positions, front and back, almost always occur on the ground. In addition, it's quite possible to become a champion in Jiu-Jitsu without ever practicing takedowns, since you always have the option of sitting to guard position. Because of this, the standing position has historically been underemphasized in training in Jiu-Jitsu. The usual response to this problem has always been to look at other grappling arts, such as wrestling and Judo, and take a little technique from these and try and attach it to your own game. Usually this is done shortly before a competition, and so for 2 or 3 weeks, people practice takedowns derived from Judo and wrestling before they enter into whatever competition they've enrolled for. This can work up to a certain level, but if Jiu-Jitsu is to truly progress in standing skills, it must develop its own standing skill set appropriate for its own rules and demands. Wrestling and Judo have very different rules and demands from Jiu-Jitsu. Technique taken from them must be heavily changed and adapted and built into a Jiu-Jitsu framework. Moreover, this skill set must be practiced year-round as an important part of the Jiu-Jitsu skill set rather than practiced a few weeks before competition. 20 years ago, when Jiu-Jitsu students wanted to learn leg locks, they were told to study Sambo. But the rules of Sambo are very different from Jiu-Jitsu, and this approach did nothing to advance the skills of leg locking in Jiu-Jitsu. Only when Jiu-Jitsu students started their own study and experimentation with leg locks did real progress begin. We have gone from a situation where leg locks were a weakness in Jiu-Jitsu to now it is one of its greatest strengths. I believe similar things can be done with the standing skills and takedowns of Jiu-Jitsu. There's nothing wrong with looking for inspiration from wrestling and Judo. But I do look forward to a future where Jiu-Jitsu students are strong in standing takedowns and skills overall within the Jiu-Jitsu rule set, which are quite different from those of wrestling and Judo. It is important we start looking at the differences between wrestling and Judo and starting to make note of them. The first major difference is in scoring criteria. Takedowns, along with guard sweeps and knee on belly position, are the lowest scoring moves in Jiu-Jitsu. Moreover, the takedown itself is not really scored in Jiu-Jitsu, but rather the control after the takedown is scored. This is radically different from Judo and wrestling. In Jiu-Jitsu, you have to exhibit control over an opponent for up to 3 seconds after the takedown in order to get your score. As a result, many takedowns that would score highly in wrestling and Judo do not score at all in Jiu-Jitsu. The whole emphasis of Jiu-Jitsu takedown has to be redirected to the aftermath of the takedown rather than the takedown itself. In addition, Jiu-Jitsu does not reward amplitude. It does not matter how high or how hard you throw your opponent in Jiu-Jitsu. It always scores the same 2 points regardless. Because of this, Jiu-Jitsu tends to favor low momentum, low energy takedowns that confer greater control after the takedown rather than the high amplitude lifts and slams that are greatly rewarded in wrestling and Judo. Another important difference is that Jiu-Jitsu matches generally are much longer than wrestling and Judo matches. As such, the stances tend to reflect this fact. They are much higher in Jiu-Jitsu than they are in the sport of wrestling. After all, it's very difficult to maintain a low wrestling stance for a 10 to 15 minute match. Judo stances, on the other hand, tend to be too upright, as leg tackles are generally banned in most forms of Judo competition. As a result, the stance in Jiu-Jitsu tends to be a compromise somewhere between Judo and wrestling, not as upright as Judo and not as crouched as wrestling. In the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, there are very few stalling calls, far fewer than there are in wrestling and Judo. In wrestling and Judo, stalling calls are handed out very quickly and often decide matches. This, along with the longer lengths of matches, radically changes the pacing of Jiu-Jitsu in the standing position. Overall, the pace of Jiu-Jitsu in the standing position tends to be quite slower than you will typically see in wrestling and Judo matches.